The rain in Greenwich, Connecticut had a way of turning to ice before it ever touched the ground. On the night of November 14th, that ice gathered on the slate roof of the Halloway estate, on the boxwood hedges trimmed to military precision on the shoulders of a 16-year-old girl who stood in the doorway of the only home she had ever known. Her name was Savannah Whitlock. She was barefoot. Her socks had soaked through 20 minutes earlier when she'd tried to gather her belongings from the upstairs bedroom, and now her toes had gone numb against the cold marble floor of the foyer. 2 black trash bags sat beside her, slumped like exhausted travelers. Inside them was every possession she had managed to grab in the 7 minutes Roland Halloway had given her before threatening to call the Greenwich police. A pair of jeans, 3 sweaters, a photograph of her father in a silver frame, a worn copy of an architecture textbook he had given her on her 10th birthday, a small velvet pouch containing a silver signet ring. That was the sum of her 16 years. Roland Halloway stood across from her in the foyer, his hands folded behind his back, like a man inspecting a piece of damaged property. He was tall, lean, dressed in the same charcoal suit he had worn to dinner. His hair was the color of pewter combed back with a precision that suggested he had not been surprised by this evening. He had been preparing for it for a long time. In his right hand he held a small plastic evidence bag. Inside it were 3 white pills and a folded receipt from a pawn shop on the wrong side of Stamford. "You have made this very simple, Savannah," Roland said. His voice was quiet. That was the part that frightened her most. A shouting man could be reasoned with eventually. A quiet man had already made his decision. "I didn't take it," Savannah said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "I didn't take Bennett's watch. I've never touched those pills. The receipt has your signature on it. It's forged. The pawnbroker remembers you. He's lying." Roland tilted his head almost gently. "You see the problem, Savannah. Everyone is lying. The pawnbroker, Bennett, the school counselor who reported your behavior last spring, your mother. Everyone in your life is, according to you, a liar. There is only one person in this house who tells the truth, and we are looking at her." Savannah felt the cold rise up her ankles. She turned her head slowly toward the living room. Her mother was sitting on the cream-colored sofa. Vivian Whitlock, once a beautiful woman, still beautiful in the way of porcelain that has been cracked and glued back together. She wore a cashmere wrap pulled tight around her shoulders, and she was staring at the unlit fireplace as if she could not bear to look anywhere else. "Mom," Savannah said. Her mother did not move. "Mom, please." A small tremor passed through Vivian's shoulders. Her lips parted. For one suspended second, Savannah believed her mother would stand up, would cross the room, would say the words that would unwind this entire night. Vivian did not stand up. She reached instead for the manila folder resting on the coffee table. She slid out a single sheet of paper and held it loosely between 2 fingers, as if it weighed too much. "It is signed Savannah," she said. Her voice was hoarse. "I signed it this morning. The judge approved it this afternoon." "What did you sign?" "Emancipation." The word hung in the air like the last note of a piano string snapping. Savannah stared at her mother. Vivian would not meet her eyes. The fireplace was empty. The logs had not been lit. There was no warmth in the house. There had not been warmth in this house for a very long time. "You can stay with friends tonight," Roland said. "You are legally an adult in the eyes of the state of Connecticut. You will not be permitted to return to this property. If you set foot on the grounds again, you will be arrested for trespass. Do you understand?" Savannah did not answer. She understood far more than Roland realized. She understood that the trust fund her father had left for her, the trust she would have inherited at 18, was going to be drained dry in the next 20 months. She understood that her mother had not been weak tonight. Her mother had been weak for 5 years. Tonight was simply the conclusion of a long, slow surrender. She understood that her father, if he were alive, would not have permitted any of this. She bent down. She picked up the 2 trash bags. They were heavier than they should have been, and she nearly stumbled. That was when she saw him. At the top of the curving mahogany staircase, half hidden in shadow, stood Bennett Halloway, Roland's son, 19 years old, a boy who had not earned anything in his life and had never been expected to. He was leaning on the banister, his face lit dimly by the chandelier above. He was looking right at her, and he was smiling. It was a small smile, almost private, the kind of smile a man gives when a long con has finally paid off. He raised one finger to his temple slowly, deliberately, and tapped twice. A salute, a signature on his own work. Then he winked. Savannah felt the heat rise in her chest, sudden and uncontainable. She turned her head sharply toward her mother, certain that this time, Vivian would have seen it. Vivian had seen it. Savannah was certain. Their eyes met for the briefest fraction of a second. Vivian looked away. The door opened behind Savannah. The rain came in horizontal, sharp as needles. Roland's hand pressed flat against her shoulder blade and gave her the smallest, most insulting push. The cold took her like a current. The door closed behind her with a sound she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not a slam. It was worse than a slam. It was a careful, deliberate click, followed by the heavy thud of the deadbolt sliding home. Savannah stood on the front step of the only home she had ever known, holding 2 trash bags in stockinged feet that had already gone numb. She had $42 in her pocket. She was 16 years old. She would never see the inside of that house again. The wind across the manicured lawn smelled like cut cedar and approaching snow. Somewhere down the long, gated driveway, a porch light flickered through the trees. Savannah forced herself to breathe. She did not cry. She would not cry. Not on this porch. Not where they could see. She thought instead of her father. Hollister Whitlock had been an architect, a good one. A man who had built libraries and museums and one small, perfect chapel in the Berkshires that the New York Times had called the most beautiful religious structure in New England. He had been 41 years old when he died on a rain-slick stretch of the Merritt Parkway. His Mercedes wrapped around an oak tree. That had been 6 years ago. Savannah had been 10. She remembered him in pieces. The smell of pencil shavings on his hands. The way he had taught her to read architectural blueprints at the kitchen table. Sliding tracing paper across the schematic of his latest project. The way he had taken her to his studio on Saturday mornings and let her sit at the drafting table with a sharpened pencil and a sheet of vellum. Whitlock's read between the lines savvy, he had told her once. Anybody can look at a plan and see the rooms. You and me, we look for the spaces in between. That is where the truth of a building lives. She had been 7 years old. He had given her that morning a small velvet pouch. Inside it had been a silver signet ring. The Whitlock crest etched into a flat oval, too big for her finger. He had told her she would grow into it. She had carried it in her pocket every day since. 6 years after his death on a freezing Connecticut porch, with 2 trash bags at her feet and her mother locked behind a door, Savannah Whitlock reached into the pocket of her wet jeans and closed her fingers around the silver ring. It was the only thing she had left. She picked up the bags. She walked down the driveway. The gate buzzed open as she approached, then buzzed shut behind her. She heard the locking mechanism engage. She did not look back. The first 6 months were a blur of borrowed couches. There was Chloe Aldridge in Stamford, whose mother let Savannah stay until the questions began. there was a boy named Theo whose father did not ask any questions, but whose stares became a different kind of question. There was a basement in Norwalk that smelled of cat urine and a kitchen floor in Westport that was at least clean. By the spring, Savannah had stopped going to school. There was no point. She could not explain her situation to teachers. Her mother had not been listed as a guardian for 9 months. The school had records that said she had been emancipated, and emancipation, she learned quickly, was a kind of social leprosy. Adults did not know what to do with you. They wanted to help briefly, and then they wanted you to be someone else's problem. She moved north to Bridgeport. It was an industrial city. It had once made firearms and brass fittings and corsets, and it had not entirely forgiven the 20th century for taking those things away. The rents were low. The bus routes ran late. A girl could disappear into Bridgeport in a way she could not disappear into Greenwich. She found a studio apartment above an auto body shop on Howard Avenue. 300 square feet. One window that did not close all the way. The radiator clanged like a freight yard. The rent was $420 a month cash. No questions, no lease. She found work at a place called Murphy's Diner. Murphy's was a long aluminum-clad shoebox of a building that had been serving eggs and coffee on the same stretch of road since 1962. The owner, a man named Dale Murphy, was 68 years old, missing 2 fingers from a bandsaw accident in his youth, and possessed of a kind of moral clarity that had gone out of style somewhere in the Reagan administration. He looked at Savannah on the morning she walked in, took in the trash bag of her belongings sitting at her feet, and said only one thing: "You steal from me, you're gone. You work hard. You eat free." She nodded. He nodded back. That was the entire interview. For 3 years, Murphy's Diner became her world. She worked the breakfast shift, the lunch shift, and 3 nights a week the late shift, which ran from 10 until 4 in the morning. She learned to carry 6 plates on one arm. She learned to identify a drunk before he became a problem, and a problem before it became a fight. She learned to sleep in 3-hour blocks. She learned the names of every long-haul trucker who stopped between New York and Boston, and most of them learned hers. And a few of them looked out for her in the small ways that strangers can. She kept the silver ring in a pouch around her neck, on a piece of fishing line. She kept a baseball bat under her bed. She did not call her mother. On her 18th birthday, she walked to the public library on Broad Street and used a public computer to log into the financial portal for the Whitlock Family Trust. The trust had been established by her father 6 months before his death. She was the sole beneficiary. The principal balance on the day of his death had been $1,200,000. The screen loaded slowly. The current balance as of her 18th birthday was $417. She stared at the screen for a long time. She did not cry. She had become by then a person who did not cry. The tears had been processed and stored and converted into something harder and more useful. She read through the transaction history. The withdrawals had been small at first. A $4,000 disbursement for estate maintenance fees, a $9,000 disbursement for tax counsel, a $12,000 disbursement for legal review. Hundreds of small bleedings, each one signed off by a trustee whose name appeared once and was never seen again. Each one paid into a corporate account labeled in dry capital letters, Apex Holdings, LLC. Apex Holdings was a company registered in the Cayman Islands. The president of the company was listed as Roland Halloway. Savannah closed the browser. She walked back to the diner. She picked up an apron. She worked an 8-hour shift. That night, in her studio above the auto body shop with the radiator hissing and the bat under her bed, she sat on the floor and held the silver ring against her chest and allowed herself 1 minute, exactly 60 seconds to feel what she felt. Then she got up, washed her face, and went to bed. A year passed. She turned 19. She did not celebrate. It was the second week of November, almost 3 years to the day since she had been pushed out of the house in Greenwich, when the man came into the diner. He came in at 1:15 in the morning on a Tuesday. The late shift had thinned out. The truckers had gone south. There was an old woman in the corner booth nursing a coffee, and a young couple at the counter who were too tired to fight anymore. The fluorescent lights buzzed the way they always buzzed. The man sat down at the counter 2 stools from the end. He was older, 60 perhaps, maybe a little more. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who had worked physically all his life. His hair was steel gray and cut close to the scalp. He had a deeply lined face, the lines pressed in by sun and weather and patience. His hands, when he set them on the counter, were heavy and scarred and steady. He wore a canvas work jacket and a dark wool cap, which he removed and set neatly beside him. "Coffee, please," he said. "Black." His voice was low, gravelly, with the faintest trace of the Bronx in it. Savannah poured the coffee. She slid the cup toward him. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment, and Savannah felt something move in the air between them that she could not name. It was not the look of a man who wanted something. It was something else. It was the look of a man who was checking with great care to make sure something was still alive. "Anything to eat, sir?" "Just the coffee." She moved away. She refilled the old woman's cup. She wiped down the counter. She tried not to glance at the man and failed. He drank his coffee slowly. He did not look at his phone. He did not look at the television over the grill. He did not read a newspaper. He sat with the coffee, and he sat with himself. And he watched the door. After perhaps 20 minutes, he stood up. He laid a $20 bill on the counter for a coffee that cost $1.75. He pulled his cap back on. He walked toward the door. He paused with one hand on the handle. "Miss," he said without turning. Savannah looked up. "You take care of yourself, all right?" "I will. Your father was a good man." She felt the bottom of her stomach drop straight through the floor. "What did you say?" But he had already pushed the door open. The bell jangled. The cold air came in and hit her like a slap. By the time she came around the counter and reached the parking lot, there were only 2 cars in it, both of which she recognized, and a single set of footprints in the slush leading toward the road. The footprints simply stopped, as if a man had turned to mist. She walked back inside. She picked up the $20 bill. Underneath it was a folded napkin. Her hands were shaking when she opened it. The handwriting was neat, square, the letters of a man who had filled out incident reports for a living. "Your father was a good man. Stay alive, kid." That was all. No name, no phone number, no instruction. Savannah stood at the counter of Murphy's Diner with the napkin in her hand and felt for the first time in 3 years that there was someone in the world who knew her name. She did not know who he was. She did not know how he had found her. She knew only that the air had changed the way the air changes before weather. The letter from Boston came 11 days later. It arrived at the diner of all places. The envelope was cream-colored heavy, the kind of paper Savannah had not held in her hands since she lived in Greenwich. The return address was printed in black ink. Pendergast and Associates Attorneys at Law, Boston, Massachusetts. She signed for it with hands that had calluses across the knuckles. She opened it in the back office with Dale Murphy standing in the doorway and pretending he was not watching her. The letter was brief. It informed her that Eleanor Whitlock of Cold Spring, New York, had passed away. It informed her that she, Savannah Marie Whitlock, was named as the primary beneficiary of the late Eleanor Whitlock's estate. It requested her immediate presence in Boston for the reading of the will. It informed her that travel and accommodations had been arranged on her behalf, and that a car would be sent to her residence in 2 days' time. Savannah read the letter twice. She had not seen Eleanor Whitlock since she was 7 years old. She remembered her only as a tall, thin woman with white hair and very dark eyebrows who had come to her father's studio one Saturday morning and had argued with him about something Savannah had not been allowed to hear. She had brought Savannah a small wooden bird carved from a single piece of cherry wood. The bird now sat on the windowsill of her studio above the auto body shop. It was the only decoration in the apartment. After her father's funeral, Eleanor had come to the house in Greenwich exactly one time. She had stood in the foyer exactly where Savannah would later be cast out, and she had looked at Vivian and at Roland for a long time without speaking. Savannah remembered that she had been holding her mother's hand. Eleanor had glanced at her just once, and her face had softened for a fraction of a second. Then Eleanor had said to Vivian only this: "He is not yet cold in the ground." She had walked out. Vivian had told Savannah in the days that followed that Eleanor was a bitter, lonely woman who had never approved of the family. Savannah had been 10. She had believed her mother because she did not yet know that mothers could lie. Now, Eleanor was dead, and she had left everything to Savannah. Dale Murphy from the doorway cleared his throat. "Whatever it is, kid, I'll hold your shifts." Savannah looked up at him. "I don't know what to do." Dale shrugged. "Write it again, then go." She went. The car came on Thursday. It was a black town car. The driver was a quiet man in a dark suit who did not ask her any questions, and who carried her one duffel bag to the trunk as if it were a piece of luggage from the plaza. She had bought a single new sweater for the trip, with money she had saved for an emergency, and the sweater was wool, and it itched against her neck. And she sat in the back of the town car for 4 hours and watched Connecticut blur into Massachusetts and tried to slow her heart. The offices of Pendergast and Associates were on the 22nd floor of a glass tower overlooking Boston Harbor. The floor smelled of leather and old paper. The receptionist was a woman in her 50s who smiled at Savannah with a warmth that suggested she had been told in advance exactly who was coming. Jonathan Pendergast was 65 years old. He had silver hair, a tailored gray suit, and the kind of careful eyes that have spent 4 decades watching people lie. He stood up when Savannah entered, and he did not extend his hand for a shake. He gestured instead to a leather chair across from his desk. "Miss Whitlock," he said, "I am very glad to meet you finally." "Finally," in a manner of speaking. "Please, sit." She sat. On the desk between them was a thick leather folio. Beside it, on a small velvet cushion, sat a single antique brass key. The key was unusual. The bow of the key was shaped like a 5-pointed star. Pendergast saw her looking at it. He did not comment. He opened the folio. "Your great-aunt Eleanor Whitlock was an extraordinary woman," he said. "She was also a very private one. She kept her own counsel for most of her life. She was, however, not as alone in the world as she appeared to be. She kept careful watch on the people she cared about. She cared about very few people. You were one of them." Savannah said nothing. She knew, Miss Whitlock, what was done to you, the night you were removed from your mother's home, the years that followed, the state of your father's trust. She knew. Then why? Pendergast raised one finger gently. The gesture was not a rebuke. It was a request for patience. Savannah understood somehow that he had rehearsed this conversation in his head many times. "Miss Whitlock, your great-aunt was above all things a strategic woman. She believed, rightly or wrongly, that any wealth handed to a minor could be taken by the man who controlled that minor. She believed that your stepfather would have found a legal mechanism to seize anything she gave you before your 18th birthday. She believed further that adversity makes a particular kind of person, and that the particular kind of person it makes is the only kind of person who can carry what she was preparing to leave behind. What was she preparing to leave behind? We will come to that. First, I have to tell you something more difficult. He folded his hands on the desk. Eleanor did not leave you entirely unprotected, Miss Whitlock. She could not bring you home. She could not pay your rent. She could not interfere with your legal status. But she could and she did hire a man to watch over you, from a distance. For the entirety of the past 3 years, Savannah felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. Watch over me, how? He moved when you moved. He took a small apartment in Bridgeport 6 weeks after you arrived. He kept eyes on the building above the auto body shop. He kept eyes on the diner where you worked. He intervened on 3 separate occasions in situations you were never aware of. He did not contact you because Eleanor had instructed him not to. He was to remain at a distance unless your life was in immediate danger. Savannah's hand had moved of its own accord to the napkin folded in her jacket pocket. Miss Whitlock? Yes. He came to your diner on the night of November the 3rd. At 1:15 in the morning, he sat at the counter for 20 minutes. He drank a black coffee. He left a $20 bill and a note. Savannah closed her eyes. Eleanor had been in hospice for 2 weeks at that point. Pendergast continued, his voice quieter now. She was lucid. She knew the end was near. She gave him permission that night to break protocol. She wanted you to know before she was gone that you had not been alone. The note, I believe, said something about your father. It said he was a good man. He was, Pendergast said. Both of them were. He, the man at the diner, was your father's closest friend. Savannah opened her eyes. Who is he? His name is Frank Donovan. He retired from the New York City Police Department 14 years ago. He was at the time of his retirement a senior detective in the Major Case Squad. He and your father met when they were 16 years old in a public high school in the Bronx. They were friends for 25 years. He was the best man at your parents' wedding. Savannah did not remember Frank Donovan. She had been too young, but she understood now why the man at the diner had sat with such steady patience watching the door. He had been a cop for 30 years. He had been protecting her father's daughter for 3. Why are you telling me about him now? Because you are about to meet him. Pendergast slid the brass key across the desk. Miss Whitlock, your great-aunt's primary residence was a property called Ravenscroft Manor, 70 acres on a bluff above the Hudson River near Cold Spring, New York. The house has been in the Whitlock family for 4 generations. It is now yours, free and clear, with all encumbrances paid and all taxes settled in perpetuity by a separate trust she established for that purpose. He turned the page of the folio. In addition to the property she has left you, $4,100,000 in liquid assets. The funds are already in an account in your name at Boston Trust. The first transfer of $50,000 cleared this morning against the contingency that you might require immediate resources for travel clothing or counsel. The numbers did not register. $4 million was not a number. It was a sound, a high, thin sound that did not connect to anything in her body. Frank Donovan has been the caretaker of Ravenscroft Manor for the past 20 years, Pendergast said. He resides in the gardener's cottage on the grounds. He has tended the property, maintained the systems, and watched over your great-aunt during her final years. He is expecting you. He has been expecting you in one form or another since the day your father died. Savannah looked at the brass key on the desk. She thought of her father kneeling at the kitchen table, sliding tracing paper across a blueprint. Whitlock's read between the lines, savvy. That is where the truth of a building lives. She picked up the key. It was heavier than it looked. She drove north on Thursday morning through the gray spine of Connecticut and into the gold and rust hills above the Hudson. The Jeep was new. She had bought it with Pendergast's quiet help at a dealership outside Boston for $28,000 cash. It was the first thing she had ever owned that had not been given to her or scavenged. The duffel bag on the seat beside her contained her 3 sweaters, the silver ring on its fishing line, the wooden bird from her windowsill, and the antique brass key with the 5-pointed bow. The road climbed. The trees thinned, then thickened, then thinned again. She crossed the Hudson on the bare mountain bridge, and the river beneath her was wide and slate-colored, and ran south toward New York City, as it had run for 10,000 years before her name had been spoken in any house. She turned north along the river. The villages were small and old and built of stone. She passed a cemetery with a wrought iron gate, then an orchard with apples still clinging to bare branches, then a long stretch of forest in which the road simply belonged to the trees. She turned onto a private drive marked only by a single weathered post. The post bore a brass plaque green with age that read, Ravenscroft. The drive ran for almost a mile through a corridor of ancient sugar maples. The trees had not been pruned in years, and their bare branches arched over the drive and met above her windshield in a kind of Gothic vault. The light was thin and filtered. She came around a final bend. She stopped the Jeep. Ravenscroft Manor stood on a wide stone terrace at the edge of the bluff. It was 3 stories of dark gray fieldstone, shouldered with sharp gables, capped with a slate roof, gone soft with moss. A round tower rose at the eastern corner with a conical cap. The wraparound porch was deep and dark. The windows were tall and narrow, and seemed in the November light to watch her without expression. Behind the house, beyond the bluff, the Hudson River stretched away. To the north and the south, gray as a sheet of polished iron. Savannah did not know how long she sat in the Jeep. She thought of her mother who had let her go. She thought of her father who had never let her go, and who was buried in a hillside cemetery in Greenwich she had not been allowed to visit in 6 years. She thought of Eleanor, whom she had not known and who had known her, and who had reached across a decade of silence to leave her a key. She got out of the Jeep. The wind off the river was cold and smelled of cold water and wood smoke. She walked up the wide stone steps to the front porch. The boards were thick oak, weathered silver sound underfoot. She had not yet reached the door when she saw him. He was standing at the far end of the porch near the eastern corner of the house. He wore a heavy canvas work coat and the same dark wool cap he had worn at the diner. His hands, large and scarred and steady, hung at his sides. He had been waiting for her. She knew his face now. Frank Donovan had been her father's friend for 25 years. He had been, for the past 3, the only person in the world who had known where Savannah Whitlock was sleeping at night. He had stood in the parking lot of an auto body shop in Bridgeport at 2 a.m. in the cold, watching a window because a man he had loved had asked him to. He took off his cap. His hair was steel gray and cropped close. His eyes were a kind of watchful blue. He did not move toward her. He stood where he was, and he gave her the time she needed to cross the porch in her own time. She crossed the porch. She stopped in front of him. She did not know what to say. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the diner. Carefully. Patiently. The way a man looks at something to make sure it is still alive. Then he spoke. "Welcome home, Miss Whitlock." His voice was the same low, gravelly voice she remembered from the diner with that faintest trace of the Bronx in it. Your father would be proud. Savannah did not cry on the porch of Ravenscroft Manor. She had become a person who did not cry in front of strangers, and Frank Donovan was technically still a stranger. But she felt something break loose inside her chest that had been frozen for 3 years. She felt the long-held tension of survival, the watchfulness, the bat under the bed, the second locks, the sleeping in 3-hour blocks, all of it shift slightly in its mooring. She did not yet know what waited inside the house. She did not yet know about the journals in the study written in a code only an architect's daughter could read. She did not yet know about the architectural anomaly in the eastern wall of the library, the 4.5 meters of empty space that did not appear on any blueprint of record. She did not yet know that the house her father had helped redesign 2 years before his death contained behind a hidden door a vault that her great-aunt had spent a lifetime filling. She did not yet know that a man named Roland Halloway in a corner office in Stamford was about to be informed by his attorney that the entirety of the Whitlock estate had passed in a single afternoon to the stepdaughter he believed he had buried. She knew only that she was standing on a porch above the Hudson River on the first afternoon of the rest of her life, and that the man across from her had loved her father. It was enough for now. Frank Donovan stepped aside and gestured with a hand the size of a baseball mitt toward the heavy oak door. The brass key was warm in her hand from the heat of her grip. She stepped forward. She put the key in the lock. She turned it. The door of Ravenscroft Manor swung open, and the air inside, dry and cold and full of decades, met her on the threshold like a held breath finally being released. Savannah Whitlock walked through the door. She did not look back at the river behind her, and she did not look back at the long drive that had brought her there, and she did not in that moment think of the freezing porch in Greenwich or the deadbolt that had clicked shut behind her 3 years before. She would think of those things later. For now, she walked into her father's house. The interior of Ravenscroft Manor smelled of beeswax and old paper, and 100 years of wood smoke that had soaked itself into the stone. Savannah stood in the foyer with the brass key still warm in her hand. The ceiling rose above her 2 full stories to an oval skylight of leaded glass, and the afternoon light came through the glass, the color of weak tea. A wide oak staircase climbed to the 2nd floor and split into 2 galleries, each gallery running back into the dim recesses of the house. White canvas drop cloths covered everything. They covered the grand piano in the parlor on the left. They covered the long dining table on the right. They covered the chandeliers which hung from the high ceilings in great shrouded shapes like sleeping animals. They covered the sofas and the chairs and the side tables and the lamps, and they had been covering them by the look of the dust for at least 2 years. Frank Donovan stood just inside the door behind her. He did not press her. He let her stand and look. She closed up most of it after the doctors gave her the diagnosis, he said quietly. Couldn't bear to see the house pretend everything was fine. Said it felt like a lie. When did she die? 3 weeks ago, Tuesday, in her bed. I was downstairs making coffee. Savannah turned her head slightly. She wasn't alone. No, miss. She wasn't alone. She did not know yet what to do with the grief of a woman she had not known. She set it aside the way she had learned to set things aside, and she walked forward into the parlor. The drop cloths whispered when she touched them. She pulled the nearest one back and uncovered a long French settee, upholstered in faded green velvet. She pulled another and uncovered the grand piano, a black Steinway with the lid down. She pulled a third and uncovered a tall, narrow secretary desk, the kind her father would have known the date of at a single glance. She did not pull all of them. There was time. There was suddenly, and for the first time in her lifetime. She turned to Frank. There's a study somewhere. It was not a question. He nodded anyway. 2nd floor, east wing, end of the hall. She kept it the way she liked it. I haven't touched anything. Savannah climbed the stairs. The second-floor hallway was paneled in dark walnut and lined with framed photographs. Most of them faded sepia, most of them of people Savannah did not recognize. At the far end of the east wing, the hallway terminated in a single door of heavy oak with a brass knob that had been polished by 100 years of hands. She opened it. The study was not a museum. That was her first thought, and it surprised her. She had expected a museum. Instead, she found a working room. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books, but the books had been read. The spines were cracked. Pencils sat in brass cups on the partner desk. A pair of reading glasses lay folded on a stack of correspondence. A green banker's lamp still had its chain pulled. There was a small fireplace with the ashes of a real fire still in the grate. The desk was the size of a single bed. It faced a tall casement window that looked out across the bluff to the river beyond. On the desk, neatly stacked, were 16 leather-bound journals. Savannah crossed to the desk. She picked up the topmost journal. She opened it. The first page was dated 31 years ago. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, decisive. It was a woman's hand. Savannah recognized at the bottom of the page the same dark, deliberate signature she had seen on the bequest documents in Pendergast's office. Eleanor Whitlock. She read the first page. Then she read the second. Then she stopped reading and held the book against her chest and looked out the window at the gray November river and tried to keep her breathing even. The first journal, the one closest to her hand, was 31 years old. Eleanor had been keeping these books for at least 3 decades. They were not diaries. They were not social calendars. They were ledgers carefully and meticulously coded of what Eleanor had called on the 4th page of the first volume The Burden in the Cellar. Savannah did not yet know what the burden in the cellar was, but Eleanor had clearly known. For 31 years, she set the book down. She crossed to the bookshelf. She ran her fingers along the spines until she found the most recent volume. The most recent was thinner than the others. The handwriting was more spidery, more tired, but still clear. The last entry was dated 4 weeks before Eleanor's death. It read in part, "The girl is in Bridgeport. She is thinner than her mother was at her age. F reports she has begun closing the back exit of the diner with a chair under the handle. Smart. She has her father's instincts, even if she does not know it yet. The wolf in Greenwich has begun moving funds again. He believes himself to be cleverer than he is. He always has. When she comes, F will bring her here, and she will read between the lines as Hollister taught her. She will find what we have built. God willing, she will use it." Savannah closed the book. She stood very still in the study of a woman she had not known. The wolf in Greenwich. She had been thought of. For 31 years in this room, on this desk, by this lamp, a woman had been writing about her family with a clarity that her own mother had never possessed. Eleanor had known about Roland from the beginning. Eleanor had been watching the trust accounts. Eleanor had been waiting. Savannah turned to look out the window again. The river ran south. Somewhere far down its valley, Roland Halloway sat in a corner office and did not yet know that his careful, patient, 2-decade strategy had reached the only person in the world he had failed to account for. She went down the stairs. Frank was in the kitchen. He had put a kettle on. He moved through the kitchen the way men of his generation did, economical and quiet. Having learned in some long-ago barracks or precinct house that a man should be able to make his own coffee without making a production of it. He looked at her face when she came in. "Anything." "She wrote about my father." He did not pretend to be surprised. "What did she write, B?" "That he taught me to read between the lines." Frank poured the water. He set a mug in front of her. The mug was heavy ceramic white chipped along one edge. "That's a thing he used to say," he said. "Even when we were kids, he'd see a guy on the corner and tell me what was wrong with him just from the way the guy was standing. He said anybody could see the rooms. He looked for the spaces in between. He told me the same thing." "Well," Frank said, "that's because he meant it." Savannah wrapped her hands around the mug. The heat spread into her palms. She had not realized how cold she was. "Frank?" "Yes, miss." "Don't call me miss." He almost smiled. "All right." "Frank, how long did you know him?" He thought about it. 41 years by the time he died. Met him in 10th grade. We were the only two kids in our high school taking drafting class instead of shop. That's how it started. My mother said he was self-made. Your father was self-made, yes. Your mother said a lot of things, and some of them happened to also be true. Savannah looked at him over the rim of the mug. "Did you like her?" Frank considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I liked her when she was 26. I liked her less when she was 30. I stopped liking her when she put a man between her and her own daughter. That's about how I feel." "I figured." She drank. The first 2 weeks at Ravenscroft passed in a kind of slow, cautious ritual. Savannah moved through the house room by room. She took a notebook with her and wrote down what she found. She uncovered the parlor, then the dining room, then the music room, then the conservatory at the back of the house with its tall iron and glass roof and its dead orange tree in a terracotta pot. She wrote down the dimensions of each room. She wrote down what she liked. She wrote down what she would change. It was the architect's daughter in her doing the writing, and she did not realize at first that she was doing it. Frank slept in the gardener's cottage at the edge of the orchard. He came up to the main house in the morning to make coffee. He came up again at dinner time with whatever he had cooked for himself, which was usually enough for two. He did not impose himself. He did not fill the silence. He let her talk when she wanted to talk and let her be quiet when she wanted to be quiet. On the third evening, over a meatloaf he had made in his own kitchen and carried up the path under a cloth, he told her a story about her father. "Your dad and me, we were 19 years old," Frank said. "We were both at City College in New York. He was studying architecture. I was studying criminal justice. We had no business being friends. He was already drawing buildings. I was already getting into bar fights, but we were friends. And one night we went out to a place down on Bleecker, just a little place, and there was a kid in the corner getting worked over by 3 guys for, I don't even remember what for. Maybe nothing. Maybe just for being there. Your dad got up. I got up after him because I figured if he was going, I had to go. He walked over and he tapped the biggest one on the shoulder and he said, 'Excuse me, gentlemen, but I think you're misreading the room.'" Frank smiled at his plate. "That was your dad. He was about 160 pounds, soaking wet. He looked at 3 guys with 100 pounds on him each, and he said, misreading the room, like they had just made a small architectural error. What happened, Frank said, is that I broke a chair on the back of one of them, and your dad broke his own hand on the jaw of another, and the third one ran. Your dad got his hand set in a hospital on 10th Street. The kid in the corner thanked us and bought us hamburgers. Your dad was always doing that. He was always seeing what the room was actually about." Savannah did not cry, but she sat with her fork in her hand for a long time, and Frank let her. In the second week, she opened the architectural drawings. She found them in a long mahogany drawer in the study, rolled into tubes and tied with cotton ribbon. Each tube was labeled in her great-aunt's writing. "Ravenscroft Original, 1923. Ravenscroft. First renovation, 1947. Ravenscroft, second renovation, 2009. She unrolled the 1923 plans on the partner desk. She weighted the corners with brass paperweights. She studied them by lamplight. The original Ravenscroft had been a hunting lodge for a New York City steelman. A 4-bedroom stone structure built into the bluff with views of the river. It was a beautiful drawing. The architect had been a man named Carrington, and his draftsmanship was the careful, slightly mannered style of the period. She unrolled the 1947 plans. The 1947 renovation had added the conservatory and rebuilt the kitchen. Nothing structurally significant. She set those aside. Then, with hands that had grown steadier in 2 weeks than they had been in 6 years, she unrolled the 2009 plans. The drawings were her father's. She knew his line before she knew his stamp. She knew the way he drew a door jamb. She knew the way he labeled a load-bearing wall. She knew the small, precise ticks he used to indicate elevation changes and the way he laid in his title block in the bottom right corner with the firm name across the top in plain capitals. Whitlock and Associates, New York. Project number 0907. Client Eleanor S. Whitlock. She sat back in the leather chair. Her father had been the architect of the second Ravenscroft renovation. He had done the work 2 years before he died. For Eleanor. For a great-aunt that Savannah's mother had described all of Savannah's life as a bitter, lonely woman who had no contact with the family. Savannah leaned forward. She stared at the drawings. She had been taught by her father, sitting at the kitchen table in Greenwich at the age of 9, that an architect leaves himself in the work. Anybody can sign the title block savvy. The signature you actually want is in the way the staircase wraps around the chimney. That's where I really live. She began to read the drawings the way a daughter reads a letter from a father who has been dead for almost a decade. 2 hours passed. Frank brought her a sandwich and a fresh mug of coffee and did not interrupt. He stood in the doorway, watched her work, and went back downstairs. She found it on the 3rd sweep. The eastern wall of the library. On the original 1923 plans, the eastern wall of the library had been an exterior wall. The library was built into the eastern flank of the house with a tall window onto the side garden. On the 2009 plans, the eastern wall of the library was no longer an exterior wall. It had become an interior partition. There was now a structural envelope on the far side of it. The new envelope was unlabeled. There were no rooms inside it. There were no doors marked into it. There was no plumbing run to it. There was no electrical service indicated. It was on the drawing simply a sealed mass of dead space, 4.5 meters of it, running the entire length of the library wall. Savannah measured the page with the brass scale ruler from the desk. Then she measured it again. The numbers did not change. There was a room behind the library. Her father had built it. He had not labeled it on his own drawings. Savannah stood up. The blood was loud in her ears. She walked slowly down the stairs through the foyer into the library on the eastern side of the ground floor. The library was a cathedral of books. The shelves rose to the 10-foot ceiling on 3 sides. A rolling ladder ran along a brass rail. The 4th wall, the eastern wall, was floor-to-ceiling oak shelving filled with several thousand volumes, ranging from leather-bound encyclopedias to cloth-bound first editions to a long shelf of architectural references that she now realized her father had probably stocked himself. She walked to the eastern wall. She put her palm flat against the wood. It was cold, colder than the rest of the house. She stepped back. She looked at the floor. There was an oriental rug across the middle of the library, deep red and faded gold, anchored under the leather chair and the reading table. She knelt down. She pulled back the corner of the rug. The hardwood underneath was scuffed. It was scuffed in a perfect arc. The arc began at the base of the central section of the eastern bookcase and swept outward along the floor in a clean, repeated curve, as if a heavy section of shelving had been swung outward on a hinge several hundred times over many years. Savannah stood up. She stepped back from the wall. She looked at the bookcase the way her father had taught her to look at a wall. She did not look at the rooms. She looked at the spaces in between. The central section of the eastern bookcase was 30 inches wide. It ran from the floor to the ceiling. The shelf brackets on either side of it did not quite line up with the shelf brackets above and below it. The grain of the wood on close inspection was very slightly different. It was the same species of oak, but it had been milled at a different time. It was a door. Savannah stood in the library of Ravenscroft Manor and understood in a single suspended moment that her father had built her a door. He had built it 2 years before he died. He had not labeled it on his drawings, but he had built it for someone who knew how to read between the lines. She did not open it that night. 2 reasons. The first was that Frank Donovan had walked up to the main house at 6 in the evening and informed her that a black Mercedes SUV had been seen by the postmaster of Cold Spring, idling at the gates of the property at 10 in the morning and again at 2 in the afternoon, and that the postmaster had recognized the driver from the description Frank had given him. The driver had been Roland Halloway. The passenger had been Vivian Whitlock. They had not rung the gate. They had simply sat in the car, watching the drive. "He's measuring the place," Frank said. "He wants to know what he's coming for." How did he find it? He didn't have to find it. The estate transfer was filed in Putnam County Surrogate's Court 11 days ago. It's public record. Pendergast warned us this would happen. What does he want? What does any predator want, kid? He wants to take it. The house and the money and you, in whatever order is most efficient. Savannah looked toward the library. She looked back at Frank. "I'm not ready for him yet." "No," Frank agreed. "You're not. You need a couple of days. Will he come up the drive?" "Eventually." "How long do I have?" Frank thought about it. 3 days, maybe 4. He's a planner. He'll want to file a probate challenge first to put a freeze on you. Then he'll come up here for what he'll call a family conversation. Then I have 3 days. Then you have 3 days. The second reason she did not open the door that night was that she went back upstairs and read her great-aunt's most recent journals by the light of the green banker's lamp. She read for 4 hours. She read the careful, coded entries about the burden in the cellar. She read about the ledgers Eleanor had been keeping for 31 years on the financial doings of certain men in certain offices in certain coastal cities, men whose names Savannah did not know, but whose initials Eleanor had recorded with the patience of a woman who had nothing left to do but watch and wait. She read about the men in the locked rooms in Albany. She read about the offshore account in the Caymans registered to Apex Holdings, LLC, into which money had been quietly draining from the failed architectural firm of Whitlock and Associates in the months leading up to Hollister Whitlock's death. She read this entry dated 13 years and 7 months ago. "R came to the house today. I had not seen him in 8 months. He was charming, as he always is when he wants something. He wanted Hollister to allow Apex Holdings to be carried as a vendor on the Whitlock and Associates books. He wanted the firm to invoice Apex for consulting services that would never be performed. He used the word lubrication. Hollister told him no. R smiled and said, 'You'll regret this, Hollister. Your wife and your daughter will be the first to pay.' R left. Hollister stood in this room for a long time and did not speak. 3 months later, he was dead. I will never forgive myself for not warning him more clearly. I will never forgive him for not listening." Savannah closed the journal. She sat in the lamplight and felt something settle into a permanent place inside her chest. She had known in some animal and unprovable way since her father's funeral that he had not died on the Merritt Parkway because the rain was bad. She had known it the way a child knows that the family dog has been put down, even when they have been told it ran away. The information had lived in her body without form. Now, in her great-aunt's hand on a page in front of her, it had a form. Roland Halloway had threatened her father. 3 months later, her father was dead. Her mother had married Roland 8 months after that. She closed the journal. She put the journal back. She turned off the green banker's lamp. She went to bed. She did not sleep. The next morning, she went to the library and she opened her father's drawings again. And she found something she had missed. Her father had drawn a small mark in the lower right corner of the 2009 plans, just above his signature. It was a 5-pointed star, no bigger than a pencil eraser. It was not an architectural symbol. It was not part of the title block. She had thought on first reading that it was a doodle. It was not a doodle. She walked to the desk in the foyer where Pendergast's package had been laid out. She picked up the velvet pouch. She removed the antique brass key. The bow of the key was a 5-pointed star. She held the key against the drawing. The shapes were identical. Her father had drawn the head of the key into his own blueprint. He had left her the address of the door. 2 days later, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the black Mercedes SUV came up the drive. Frank had seen it from the cottage. He had walked up to the main house ahead of it calmly, without hurry, and he had let himself in through the kitchen door. He had taken off his work coat. He was wearing underneath it a clean blue shirt and a leather shoulder rig holstering a service-grade revolver that Savannah had never seen before. He saw her looking at it. "Old habits," he said. "You expecting trouble? Always?" She nodded. She went to the door. Roland and Vivian were already on the porch. Roland looked. Savannah thought exactly the same as he had on the night 3 years ago that he had pushed her out into the rain. He was thinner, perhaps. The pewter hair had gone whiter at the temples. The suit was a different cut. But the face, the careful, watchful, civilized face, was the same. Vivian stood half a step behind him. She had aged. That was what struck Savannah first. 3 years had happened to Vivian, and Vivian had not been ready for them. The skin under her eyes was thin. Her makeup did not entirely cover the new lines at the corners of her mouth. She looked for one dangerous second like a woman who had been 45 years old when she signed her 16-year-old daughter out of her life and who had spent every day since being 45. Savannah opened the door but did not step back. She did not invite them in. "Savannah." It was Vivian who spoke first. Her voice was higher than Savannah remembered, brittle. "Sweetheart, we have been so worried. We've been trying to find you for years. You changed the locks the morning after you signed the papers, Mom. Savannah, please, what do you want?" Roland stepped forward smoothly, the way a salesman steps in when the customer has begun to refuse. "Savannah, come now. There's no need for hostility. We've come a long way today. May we come in?" "No." "Savannah." "What do you want, Roland?" He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting 6 years to use it. "We want to help." "Help with what?" "You're 19 years old. You have inherited an enormous estate and a property with significant tax exposure and ongoing maintenance costs. Eleanor was a wonderful woman, but she was not in her later years fully herself. The bequest documents she signed are likely to be challenged in court. We've already begun the petition. We'd like to spare you that. We'd like to come to a family arrangement. We're prepared to act as co-trustees on your behalf to ensure the property is maintained. The funds are protected, and you are not exposed to the kind of predatory legal action that often accompanies inheritances of this size. It would simplify your life considerably by taking control of it, by protecting it. From whom? From people who would take advantage of a young woman without business experience. Savannah looked at him for a long moment. She looked at her mother. Her mother would not meet her eyes again. She looked back at Roland. "You knew Eleanor," she said. It was not a question. It came out of her mouth before she had quite decided to say it. But the moment she said it, she watched Roland's face. She watched it the way her father had taught her to watch a wall. She did not look at the room. She looked at the spaces in between. For a fraction of a second, somewhere deep behind the careful, civilized face, something flinched. He recovered immediately. "I met Eleanor twice, at family functions, many years ago." "That's not what I asked." "Savannah, you came up here, to this house, in 2010, to see my father." The flinch came again, larger this time. It moved briefly to the corner of his mouth. "I don't know what you've been told, Savannah," but Eleanor was by the end deeply confused. Her perceptions of past events. You came up here. You sat in that study. You asked my father to put a fake company on his books. He told you no. 3 months later, he was dead. The porch was very quiet. The wind off the river moved through the bare branches of the maples. Vivian made a small sound. It was not a word. It was something closer to the sound a person makes when a glass slips out of their hand. Roland's smile had gone. The civilized face had gone with it. What was left was the thing that had always been underneath. And Savannah understood, looking at it, that her stepfather had never wanted to deceive her. Her stepfather had wanted to own her. Deception had been a means. "You watch yourself, little girl," he said. His voice had dropped a full register. "You don't know what game you're playing. Eleanor played it longer than you can imagine, and she's in the ground now. Don't follow her there before you have to. Get off my property, Savannah. Get off my property, Roland. Both of you. Savannah." She did not raise her voice. "I will count to 10. If you are still on this porch when I reach 10, the man inside this house will arrest you for trespass. He spent 30 years in the New York City Police Department, and he is not nervous about you. Then I will call the New York State Police and they will arrest you again. Then I will spend a small portion of my new fortune ensuring that everyone you have ever shared a board seat with reads about it on the front page of the Greenwich Time." 1. Roland stared at her. 2. He did not move. 3. Vivian stepped back first. She put her hand on Roland's sleeve. He did not look at her. He looked at Savannah. 4. You don't have any idea. 5. He turned. He walked down the steps. Vivian hurried after him. The Mercedes door slammed twice. The engine started. Savannah did not move from the doorway until the car had disappeared down the long corridor of maples and the gate had closed. Then she went inside. Frank was standing in the foyer. He had drawn the revolver. It was held loose at his side, the muzzle pointed at the floor. "You all right?" "Yes." "You sure?" "I'm sure." He let out a long breath. He holstered the gun. "Well," he said, "now we know." "Now we know what?" "Now we know that he knew Eleanor played a long game. He said it. He actually said it on the porch. He's known about this place for a long time, Savannah. He's been afraid of it for a long time. That's because it has something in it. What? She turned her head toward the library. Come with me. She told Frank everything she had found. She told him about the drawings. She told him about the eastern wall of the library and the 4.5 meters of dead space and the scuffed arc on the floor under the rug. She told him about the small 5-pointed star her father had drawn into the corner of the 2009 plans. The same star that formed the head of the brass key Pendergast had handed her in Boston. She told him about the journals, about 31 years of careful coded entries about the burden in the cellar. She told him about her father's last conversation with Roland. Frank listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. He stood in the library looking at the eastern wall, and his jaw was set in a way Savannah had not yet seen. He was my friend, Frank said finally. I know. I have been waiting 12 years to find out what that night actually was. I know. He turned to look at her. You want to open it tonight? She thought about it. She thought about Roland in the Mercedes driving south, calling whatever lawyer he kept on retainer, ordering whatever filing he was already mentally drafting. She thought about the 30-day clock that Pendergast had warned her about the probate challenge, that would freeze her ability to spend any of the inheritance, and would, if she did not respond competently, place her assets under the temporary supervision of a court-appointed guardian. She thought about the fact that the obvious nominee for that guardianship was her own mother. She had 3 weeks, maybe a little less. Yes, she said. I want to open it tonight. Frank nodded. Then let me go get my flashlight. She walked to the central section of the eastern bookcase. She knelt on the rug. The bottom shelf held a row of heavy reference volumes, leather-bound, the gold leaf rubbed off the spines. She ran her fingers along them. She had read enough Eleanor by now to know that her great-aunt would have chosen the trigger book carefully. She had read enough of her father by now to know that he would have chosen it carefully too. The third book from the left was a volume titled in faded gilt, Architecture of Antiquity. It was a book about classical Greek and Roman buildings. Her father had loved classical architecture. She put her hand on the spine. She pulled. The book did not slide. It tilted. It tilted forward 2 inches on a hinge inside the shelf. With a small, satisfying mechanical click, deep inside the wall behind the bookcase, a heavy chain shifted. A counterweight engaged. The entire central section of the eastern bookcase, 10 feet tall and 30 inches wide, eased forward on a set of concealed industrial hinges. It moved with the quiet competence of well-engineered machinery. It swung outward into the library exactly along the arc that had been worn into the floorboards by 12 years of Eleanor's quiet visits. A draft of cold air came out of the opening. The air smelled of ozone and concrete and old paper. Behind the bookcase was a vestibule of steel-clad walls. In the far wall of the vestibule was a heavy door. The door was made of dull, polished steel. It had a modern biometric scanner mounted at chest height. Beneath the scanner was a smaller, older-looking keyhole. The keyhole was star-shaped. Savannah heard the front door open. She heard Frank's heavy work boots on the foyer floor. He came into the library carrying a heavy black flashlight in one hand, and in the other a coil of what looked like new electrical cord and a roll of duct tape, as though he had been preparing for exactly this evening for some long time. He stopped when he saw the open bookcase. He looked at the steel vestibule. He looked at the heavy door. He let out a slow breath. My God, he said. Hollister. Savannah took the brass key from her pocket. She stepped into the vestibule. She did not yet know that behind the heavy door, a spiral of military-grade steel stairs descended 3 full stories into the bedrock of the bluff. She did not yet know that at the bottom of those stairs, A vault the size of the entire footprint of the house above was filled with the meticulous evidence of 31 years of careful watching. She did not yet know that at the center of the vault, on a mahogany desk, identical to the partner desk in the upstairs study, a thick red folder waited under a small handwritten note for Savannah. "When you are ready." She did not yet know that what she was about to read would tell her page by page the exact mechanism by which her father had been killed. She knew only that the brass key was warm in her hand. She knew only that she was 19 years old, and that her father had built her a door, and that the door had her name on it in a language that no one but the two of them had ever been able to read. She slid the key into the star-shaped keyhole. She turned it. The tumblers shifted with a deep-oiled ancient sound. Savannah Whitlock put her hand on the cold steel and pushed. The door swung inward. The lights came on. The lights came on in stages the way good security lighting does. The vestibule first, then the staircase, then far below a deeper glow that suggested a much larger room. Frank stood at Savannah's shoulder. He looked at the spiral of steel that descended into the bluff. He let out a low whistle, the kind a builder makes when another builder has done unusually serious work. "That's reinforced plate," he said. "Quarter-inch minimum, bolted into the bedrock. This isn't a wine cellar, Savannah. No, your father built this. He built the door, he built the chamber, he let her fill it. How did he keep it off the county records? He didn't file it. Look at the 2009 set upstairs. The vault doesn't appear on any sheet that went to the building department. He drew it on a separate plate and kept it private. Jesus, he was always careful. He told me once that paper has a memory. He said you have to be careful about what you give to paper." Frank touched the steel of the doorframe the way a man touches the casket of a friend. "All right," he said. "Let's go down." She went first. The stairs were narrow. The treads were industrial steel anti-slip, slightly cold through the soles of her boots. The walls were the same plate steel as the door. She could feel against the back of her neck the constant cool draft of an active climate control system. 3 full stories. She counted the turns of the spiral. 12. She counted the steps. 128. At the bottom of the stairs, the staircase opened into a single vast, low-ceilinged room. The vault ran the entire footprint of the house above. It was perhaps 80 feet by 50. The ceiling was barely 7 feet high, which gave the space a cool, library-like intimacy. The floor was poured concrete, sealed and polished. The temperature was a perfectly maintained 65 degrees. The humidity was low. The walls were lined with fireproof lateral filing cabinets, hundreds of them. Each cabinet had a small typed label in a brass holder. Each label bore a name. The names ran in alphabetical order down one wall across the back and up the other wall. Savannah, walking slowly along the rows, did not recognize most of them. But she recognized some. A United States Senator from Albany, a federal judge from the Second Circuit, the chairman of a New England bank, the chief executive of a hedge fund whose office tower she could see on a clear day from the bluff above the river. And on the cabinet third, from the end of the left wall, in a label that had clearly been added more recently than the others in a typed font that matched the others exactly 3 names. Halloway Roland M. Whitman, Gregory P. Apex Holdings, LLC. Savannah stopped in front of that cabinet. Frank came to a stop beside her. "That," he said, "is what we came down here for." "No," Savannah said. "We came down here for what's on the desk." She pointed. In the center of the vault, beneath a single hooded brass lamp that had come on with the rest of the lighting, sat a mahogany partner desk identical to the one in Eleanor's study 3 stories above. The desk was clean. There was nothing on it but a green leather blotter, a brass pen stand, and one thick accordion fold folder, bound with a length of ordinary red string. Across the front of the folder, taped at the top in clear archival tape, was a small handwritten note in Eleanor's slanted, decisive hand. For Savannah, when you are ready. Savannah pulled out the heavy leather chair behind the desk. She sat down. She untied the string. The folder opened the way old folders do, breathing out the dust of patience. The first document was on top. Eleanor had organized everything for her. Eleanor had been organizing everything for her for 31 years. The first document was a private forensic report. The letterhead bore the name of an automotive forensics firm in Hartford, Connecticut. The date was 11 and a half years old. The report had been commissioned, the cover letter said, by Eleanor S. Whitlock, as a private inquiry into the vehicular fatality of Hollister J. Whitlock on the Merritt Parkway. Savannah read the executive summary. She read it twice. The brake lines on her father's 2009 Mercedes had not failed because of wear. They had not failed because of a manufacturing defect. They had failed because of a localized chemical degradation isolated to a 6-inch section of the front passenger side line, consistent with the application of a slow-acting corrosive agent. The agent had been engineered to react only at elevated brake fluid temperatures. On a cold, dry road, the brakes would have functioned normally. On a wet road that demanded heavy braking, the line would have ruptured at exactly the moment of greatest stress. The author of the report had recommended that the findings be referred to a state homicide investigator. Eleanor had not done that. Eleanor Savannah realized had been waiting for a different kind of justice. Eleanor had been waiting for a daughter. Frank was reading over her shoulder. She heard the slow exhale of a man who had spent 30 years carrying the weight of a question he had never been able to ask out loud. "He didn't run off the road," Frank said quietly. "No, he was murdered." "Yes, by Roland Holloway, among others." She set the forensic report aside. The next document was a packet of bank statements. Cayman Islands. The account belonged to Apex Holdings, LLC. The signatory was Roland M. Holloway. The account had been opened 7 months before her father's death and had received its first significant deposit, a wire of $110,000 from an unrelated shell entity 11 days before her father had refused Roland's request in Eleanor's study upstairs. The next document was a packet of email printouts. The emails had been recovered. Savannah realized as she read from the personal server of Gregory Whitman, then a vice president at the Bank of New England, now the president of its commercial lending division. They had been recovered. The small notation on the cover sheet indicated by an information broker in Boston who had owed Eleanor a debt of long standing. The emails were exchanged between Whitman and Roland Holloway. They began 9 months before her father's death. They documented in clear and unguarded language the systematic falsification of loan covenants against Whitlock and Associates. They documented the manufactured creation of a debt spiral that had nothing to do with the actual financial health of the firm. They documented on the third email of the third printed page a brief instruction from Roland to Gregory which read, "In part, we need to accelerate. The principal is becoming difficult. Bring it to a head before he can refinance with a competitor." The principal was her father. The acceleration meant in plain English the destruction of his business. 3 months after that email, her father was dead. Savannah read every page. She did not skim. She did not skip ahead. She read the way her father had taught her to read. She looked for the spaces in between. She found on page 11 a memo from an investigator Eleanor had hired in 2014, 2 years after the death. The investigator had located a witness, a former assistant at Whitman's bank, who recalled overhearing Whitman take a phone call on the morning of her father's death. The witness recalled that Whitman had been pale when he hung up. The witness recalled that Whitman had said into the empty office, "I told him not to do it on a wet night." The witness had been afraid to come forward at the time. Eleanor had paid the witness's mother's hospice bills for 2 years. The witness had not been afraid after that. Savannah closed her eyes for one slow moment. She opened them. She continued. At the back of the folder was a separate, smaller envelope. It had been sealed with a wax stamp, the wax pressed into the same 5-pointed star that adorned the brass key in her pocket. The seal had never been broken. The handwriting on the outside of the envelope was not Eleanor's. It was her father's. It read in his careful draftsman's letters only 2 words: "For Savvy." Her hands shook. She did not allow herself to weep. Not yet. She had not earned it yet. She slid a brass letter opener under the wax. She broke the seal. Inside the envelope were 2 things. The first was a letter. The second was a small audio cassette in a clear plastic case. The cassette was labeled in her father's hand with one date. The date was 3 months before his death. She read the letter first. He had written it the morning after Roland had threatened him in the study upstairs. He had written it because, as he wrote, he had spent the night thinking about the shape of the threat. And he had concluded that the threat was credible and that he was a man with a wife and a daughter and a firm, and that the cost of preparation was small compared to the cost of being unprepared. He apologized in the letter for the fact that she might be reading it. He told her that if she was reading it, then his preparation had not been enough. He told her not to be afraid. He told her that she was the daughter of a man who had married a woman who could not in the end see clearly. He told her that this was not her fault, and not entirely her mother's fault either, because some people had grown up in a kind of weather that bent them and did not let them unbend. He told her that her great-aunt Eleanor was the most intelligent member of the Whitlock family, and that if anything ever happened to him, she should listen to Eleanor, who would know what to do. He told her that he loved her more than the trade had words for. He told her to read the spaces between the lines. He told her in the last paragraph that he was leaving her one true thing in this folder. Not a fortune, not a property, not even his name. He was leaving her. He said his voice. The cassette was a recording he had made on a small Olympus dictation machine that he had carried in his pocket the morning Roland had come up to Ravenscroft. He had carried it without Roland's knowledge. He had recorded the entire conversation. He had given the cassette to Eleanor for safekeeping, and he had asked Eleanor to keep it sealed until and unless his daughter one day came down the stairs of the room they had built together and read between the lines and found her way to it. The letter ended with one sentence. "The truth is in your ear now, Savvy. Use it well." Savannah did weep then. It was a quiet weeping. It did not last long. Frank stood beside her and did not move and did not speak. And when she was finished, she wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist, and she straightened, and she picked up the cassette. Frank produced from a small leather case he had carried down the stairs, without her noticing, an old portable cassette recorder. He had known. Of course he had known. She did not ask how. He set the recorder on the desk. He pressed the eject. He laid the cassette in the cradle. He pressed play. The audio began with the sound of footsteps on hardwood, then her father's voice, low, calm, unmistakable. "Roland, come in. Eleanor's gone to town. We have the place to ourselves." The next voice that came out of the speaker was Roland Halloway's voice from 12 years earlier. It was, Savannah noticed, a slightly younger voice, smoother in the upper register. But it was unmistakably the same man who had stood on her porch 3 days ago and told her she did not know what game she was playing. She listened to the entire recording. It ran 14 minutes. It contained in clear English Roland's request for the use of Whitlock and Associates as a money laundering vehicle, her father's refusal, and the precise threat Eleanor had quoted in her journal. "You'll regret this, Hollister. Your wife and your daughter will be the first to pay." Frank stopped the tape. The vault was very quiet. Frank, who was 62 years old and had been a New York City homicide detective for most of his adult life, set both hands flat on the mahogany desk and looked down at them for a long time. "He said it on tape," he said. "He said it on tape. For the love of God. Yes. Then we have him." Savannah looked up. "No," she said. "We don't have him yet. We have evidence. We have to build the trap." Frank looked at her. He looked at her for a long, considering moment, the way a man looks at a piece of unfinished work and realizes that the work has somewhere, in the last hour, finished itself. "All right, kid," he said. "How do you want to play it?" The next 12 weeks were the most disciplined work of Savannah Whitlock's life. She did not call the Putnam County Sheriff. She did not call the Connecticut State Police. She did not, in spite of the fact that her hand reached for the phone several times in the first 2 days, call her mother. She called Jonathan Pendergast at 3 in the morning on a Wednesday and told him what she had found. Pendergast was silent for 90 seconds. Then he said only, "Do not move from the house. I will be at Ravenscroft by noon." He arrived at 11:52 with a leather satchel, 2 younger associates from his firm, and a black coffee in a thermos. Savannah laid the case out for him on the partner desk in the upstairs study. Pendergast read the forensic report. He read the bank statements. He read the email printouts. He listened to the cassette twice, with his eyes closed the way old lawyers listen to evidence they intend never to forget. When he was finished, he set the recorder down very carefully and looked at Savannah across the desk. "This is a federal case," he said. "I know. It is not a state homicide. It is not a probate matter. It is not a civil claim. It is conspiracy. It is wire fraud. It is interstate money laundering. It is murder for hire. It will be tried in the Southern District of New York or the District of Connecticut. The lead agency will be the Federal Bureau of Investigation." "I know. Do you understand what I am saying to you, Savannah? You're saying that the moment we hand this over, it leaves my hands. I become a witness. The case becomes the United States of America versus Roland Holloway." "Yes." "Good. That's what I want." He looked at her again, the careful eyes that had spent 4 decades watching people lie. He had, she realized, been watching for a particular thing. He saw it. He did not smile. "I will make the call to the New Haven field office this afternoon." No, not yet. I want him in the room first. "Savannah, I want him to sit across the table from me with his lawyers and his probate filing, and his wife crying on cue. I want him to lay out his case for taking control of my inheritance. I want him to do it with his own mouth in his own conference room on his own letterhead. And then I want the FBI to walk through the door." Pendergast considered this for a long moment. "You want him to convict himself in front of his wife. I want him to convict himself in front of my mother." Pendergast nodded slowly. "That can be arranged. I'll need 3 months. You can have 3. She used the 3 months well. She accepted, through her attorney, Roland's invitation to a private mediation at his firm in Stamford. The mediation was scheduled for a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of February. She let Roland believe she was frightened. She let her own attorneys negotiate clumsily on her behalf. conceding small points, requesting accommodations for her age and inexperience. She let him believe that he had her on the back foot. She let him draft and redraft and finally polish a settlement proposal in which Vivian Whitlock would assume co-trustee status over the Whitlock estate with Roland Holloway as advisory counsel, and in which a base distribution of 40% of liquid assets would be set aside for the family. She let Roland believe he was winning. In private, she worked. She worked with 2 FBI agents from the New Haven field office, a woman named Special Agent Mariana DeLuca, and a man named Special Agent Ellis Brody. They came to Ravenscroft 3 times. They reviewed the entire vault. They took, with Pendergast's consent and a federal preservation order, certified digital copies of every document in the Holloway cabinet. They authenticated the cassette through a forensic audio specialist in Quantico. They cross-matched the email printouts against archived server records still held at the Bank of New England. The case built itself the way a good case does. By the first week of February, Special Agent DeLuca told Savannah that the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Connecticut was prepared to file under seal the day before the mediation. The arrest team would deploy on the afternoon of the mediation itself. They would breach the conference room at a signal Savannah herself would give. What signal? Whatever you want it to be. Savannah thought about that for 2 days. She told them on the 3rd day what the signal would be. In the 3rd week of January on a Tuesday, she drove to Bridgeport. She did not tell Frank. He would have come with her, and she needed to do this alone. She drove down through the gray Connecticut afternoon and got off the highway at the exit she had taken twice a day for almost 3 years. The streets were the same. The auto body shop on Howard Avenue had a new sign. The studio above it had a new tenant. The window on the 2nd floor was cracked open exactly the way she had always kept it cracked open even in winter, because the radiator hissed too hot. She parked across the street from Murphy's Diner. She did not go in. She sat in the Jeep for almost an hour. She watched the windows fog with steam from the grill. She watched the late lunch crowd come and go. She watched the new girl behind the counter, who could not have been more than 17, carry 6 plates on her left arm and laugh at something a regular had said. Dale Murphy came out the back door at one point to drag a black trash bag to the dumpster. He was 68 years old. He had been 65 when she met him. He looked older now, but he moved exactly the way she remembered, deliberately, without hurry, with the quiet authority of a man who had run a business for 40 years without owing any other man a thing. She did not get out of the Jeep. She sat with her hands on the steering wheel and let herself remember what it had felt like to be 16 and 17 and 18, and to have nothing. She let herself remember the bat under the bed. She let herself remember the moment in front of the public library computer screen on her 18th birthday, when she had understood that her father's gift to her had been stolen. She let herself remember the napkin. Stay alive, kid. She had stayed alive. She had done more than that. She put the Jeep in gear. She drove home. The mediation was held on a Wednesday at 2 in the afternoon on the 18th floor of Roland Holloway's firm in Stamford, Connecticut. The building was a glass tower overlooking the harbor. The conference room had a long walnut table, 16 leather chairs, a sideboard with bottled water and coffee service, and a wall of windows that looked east toward the gray winter sound. Roland was already in the room when Savannah arrived. He was wearing a navy suit. He had brought 4 people with him, 2 attorneys from his firm, a junior associate carrying a thick brown leather portfolio, and seated to his right with her hands folded carefully, in her lap, Vivian Whitlock. Vivian was wearing pearls. She was wearing a cream wool dress that Savannah remembered from her own childhood. It had been her grandmother's. Vivian had brought it out. Savannah understood at once as a kind of visual argument. She was the matriarch. She was the family. She was the rightful steward. It was the wrong choice. Savannah arrived at 2:05. She was wearing a black wool suit, tailored quietly. Her hair was pulled into a low knot at the nape of her neck. She wore no makeup. Around her neck on a fine silver chain hung two small silver objects. They rested below the open collar of her white blouse. They were both signet rings, the Whitlock crest. One was the ring her father had given her at the age of 7. The other was the ring her father had been wearing on the night he died. She had begun 3 weeks earlier to wear them both. She had not yet decided when she would stop. Pendergast walked in behind her. So did the 2 younger associates from his firm. So did Frank Donovan in a clean blue shirt and a dark wool jacket carrying nothing visibly except a quiet, unbothered patience. Roland half rose from his chair. "Savannah, Roland, please sit. Can we offer you coffee, water?" "No." She sat. Pendergast sat to her left. Frank Donovan took the chair on her right. The 2 young associates sat at the far end of the table equipped with laptops and a small black audio recorder, which Pendergast asked Roland's team for permission to operate. Roland's lead attorney, a sandy-haired man named Whitfield, agreed. The recorder went on. The first hour proceeded the way Roland had planned it. He laid out his case. He spoke of Eleanor's diminished capacity. He spoke of the complexity of the Ravenscroft estate. He spoke of the tax exposure, the maintenance burden, the cost of operating a 70-acre property on the Hudson. He spoke of the fact that Savannah was 19 years old. He spoke with care. He spoke with an undercurrent of paternal concern that was, Savannah noticed, almost convincing. Vivian dabbed her eyes once, then twice. Then, she said in a small, breaking voice, "Savannah, sweetheart, we just want what's best." Savannah did not answer. Pendergast played his hand on schedule. He opened a slim leather folio. He laid out document by document the financial trail leading from the Whitlock Family Trust into Apex Holdings, LLC. He laid out the Cayman Islands account statements. He laid out the wire transfer records. He spoke calmly. He named amounts. Whitfield objected. He used the words unsubstantiated and prejudicial. Roland did not flinch. His face, had Savannah noticed, gone slightly more still. "This is a financial fishing expedition," Whitfield said. "These documents could have been fabricated. Mr. Halloway has every right to demand authentication." "He may have it," Pendergast said quietly. He slid the documents across the table. Whitfield did not pick them up. Savannah watched her stepfather's eyes. She saw the calculation begin. She knew the calculation. He had been a calculating man all of his life, and he was calculating now. He was calculating which records the trust attorneys had retained. He was calculating which counterparties might testify. He was calculating the speed at which his offshore counsel could move funds. He was beginning to understand that Pendergast had been working on this for longer than 3 months. He was beginning to understand that this room had not been called for a settlement. He shifted very slightly in his chair. Savannah took her cue. She reached down beside her own chair. She lifted without ceremony a slim leather case that Frank had brought into the room for her. She set it on the table in front of her. She opened it. She took out a single sheet of paper. She slid the sheet across the table to Roland. "What is that?" Roland said. She did not answer. Roland looked at it. It was the executive summary of the private forensic report on her father's brake lines. The room went silent. Whitfield, who had been preparing his next objection, stopped speaking with his mouth half open. Vivian, who had been adjusting her pearls, froze. Roland stared at the page. Vivian, after several seconds, leaned over to read it. She read for perhaps 15 seconds. Then she lifted her face to look at her husband. She did not say anything yet, but Savannah saw in her mother's eyes in real time the dismantling of an entire architecture of self-deception. Vivian had been telling herself a story for 12 years. The story had a single unwavering premise. The premise was that her first husband had died in a tragic accident, and that her second husband had rescued her from it. The story had allowed her to forgive herself gradually for many small things and for a few large ones. The story had been the load-bearing wall of her life. Savannah watched her mother see for the first time that the wall was not real. Then Vivian said in a voice barely above a whisper 2 words. "Roland." "What?" Savannah reached into the leather case again. She took out the small, portable cassette recorder. She set it on the table. She slid it slowly with the back of her hand into the center of the long walnut table, where everyone could see it, and where everyone could hear it. She pressed play. Her father's voice came out of the small speaker. "Roland, come in. Eleanor's gone to town. We have the place to ourselves." The room did not breathe. Roland's face had gone the color of old paper. The recording continued. Through the small speaker on a winter afternoon 12 years after the fact, a younger Roland Holloway laid out in his own voice the structure he wanted Hollister Whitlock to put in place. Through the small speaker, Hollister Whitlock told him no. Through the small speaker, the threat came. "You'll regret this, Hollister. Your wife and your daughter will be the first to pay." The recording stopped. The room remained silent for perhaps 2 full seconds. Then Vivian made a sound that was not quite a scream. It was the sound of a person who has just understood the entirety of her own life. She brought both hands to her face. Her shoulders shook. Roland did not look at his wife. He looked at Savannah. Across the long walnut table in the conference room of his own firm on the 18th floor of his own building, Roland Holloway looked at the daughter of the man he had ordered killed. And Savannah saw finally what was underneath the civilized face. It was not rage. It was not even hatred in the end. It was the cold, ancient panic of a man who had spent 12 years believing that he had buried something, and who had just heard that thing speak. He moved. He came up out of his chair so fast that the chair tipped backward and clattered against the window. He was halfway across the table before Savannah had completed the breath she had begun. He was a man 50 years old in good shape in a panic, and the panic gave him speed. She did not flinch. Frank Donovan was already standing. He had stood the moment Roland had begun to move. He had not in his entire career as a New York City detective been slow. He drew the revolver from the leather rig under his jacket in a single economical motion that did not separate from the motion of his rising. He brought the weapon up. He set it level. He aimed it at Roland Holloway's center mass across the long walnut table. His voice when he spoke was the same low gravel voice from the diner on Howard Avenue, with the faintest trace of the Bronx in it. "Sit down, Roland." Roland did not sit. He stood half-braced on the table, his palms flat on the walnut, breathing. Frank's voice did not change. "I said sit down. I am too old to chase you across a room. I will not chase you. I will simply ensure that you do not reach the other side of the table." Roland sat. He sat slowly. He sat with the look of a man who had finally understood what room he had walked into. The conference room door opened. It opened in the precise, controlled manner of a door being opened by people with badges. Special Agent Mariana DeLuca came in first. Special Agent Ellis Brody came in second. Behind them, 6 other federal agents in dark windbreakers fanned out along the walls. They moved without urgency because urgency was no longer required. DeLuca walked to the head of the table. She did not raise her voice. "Roland Holloway," she said, You are under arrest. The charges are conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder for hire across state lines. You have the right to remain silent." She continued. Savannah did not listen to the rest. She watched her stepfather. She watched him be turned to face the wall. She watched the cuffs close around his wrists. She watched his shoulders, which had been straight all of his adult life, begin to round forward in the particular slump of a man understanding that his own body was no longer his to command. She watched her mother. Vivienne had not stood up. She was still in her chair. Her hands were still over her face. The pearls had slipped slightly around to the side of her neck. When Roland was led toward the door, Vivienne dropped her hands. She turned in her chair. She looked at Savannah for the first time in 3 years. She tried to speak. She tried twice. Then she said in a voice that was hardly a voice at all, "Savannah, sweetheart, I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know." Savannah looked at her mother. She looked at the cream wool dress that had been her grandmother's. She looked at the pearls. She looked at the woman who had sat on the cream-colored sofa on a freezing Connecticut evening and had not stood up. "A mother protects her child," Savannah said. Her voice was even. It did not shake. It did not rise. "You chose him. Twice. Once when you signed those papers, and once when you stood in that supermarket and pretended I wasn't there." Vivienne began to sob. Savannah stood up. She did not walk around the table. She did not embrace her mother. She did not absolve her. She picked up the slim leather case. She slid the cassette recorder back into it. She closed the case. She turned to Pendergast and to Frank, who were both already moving toward the door. She walked out of the room without looking back. The trial took 11 months. Roland Holloway was convicted on every count. The murder for hire conviction was secured by a combination of the cassette, recording the forensic report and the testimony of Gregory Whitman, who had agreed to cooperate within 48 hours of his own arrest. Roland was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. His assets were frozen seized and ultimately liquidated to repay the clients his firm had defrauded. His name was struck from the Connecticut bar. Vivienne Whitlock was not charged with murder. She was, however, named as a defendant in the civil action brought by the Whitlock estate against the proceeds of the Apex Holdings laundering operation, and she lost. She lost the house in Greenwich. She lost the cars. She lost the country club membership. She moved into a one-bedroom rental in Norwalk. She was not in the end sent to prison. She was, however, exiled from every social circle that had ever defined her, and she lived out her remaining years in the kind of quiet, friendless poverty that does not make the newspapers, but that is in its own way a sentence. Savannah did not see her again. The vault under Ravenscroft Manor was emptied over a period of 14 months. Special Agent DeLuca handled the transfer to the Department of Justice. The hundreds of files on the senators and judges and bankers and hedge fund managers became the foundation of a federal corruption sweep that resulted over the next 2 years in the indictment of 12 sitting public officials and the resignation of many more. The story made the front page of the New York Times for 13 consecutive days. Eleanor Whitlock's name was not mentioned. That had been her last instruction, in a small sealed letter Pendergast had handed to Savannah at the end of the first week. "Use the work Eleanor had written. Do not use my name. The work is the legacy. Names are vanity." Savannah honored the instruction. The vault, when it was empty, was renovated. Savannah turned it into a secure server room and document archive for the foundation she established in her father's name. The Hollister Whitlock Foundation provided legal advocacy, transitional housing, and full college scholarships for adolescents who had been illegally emancipated or cast out by the adults responsible for their care. The first scholarship was awarded to a 17-year-old girl from Bridgeport, Connecticut, who had been working the late shift at a diner on Howard Avenue. Dale Murphy attended the award ceremony. He stood in the back of the room. He nodded at Savannah once across the heads of the audience. She nodded back. On the morning of her 22nd birthday, Savannah Whitlock stood on the wraparound porch of Ravenscroft Manor with a heavy ceramic mug of coffee in her hand. The Hudson Valley was in early spring. The maples along the long drive had begun to break bud. The river below the bluff was the deep slate blue of cold, deep water still moving toward the sea. The air smelled of cold water and wood smoke, and the first green of the year. Frank Donovan was sitting on the stone bench at the eastern end of the porch. He was 65 now. He was wearing his canvas work coat. He was smoking against his doctor's instructions a small cigar that he had been allowing himself once a year on this date for the last 3 years. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Savannah crossed the porch. She sat down on the bench beside him. Her hand, without her thinking about it, went to the silver chain at her throat. The 2 signet rings rested against her sternum. The Whitlock crest. Her father's crest. Hers now. She thought for a long moment of an evening 12.5 years before. Of a freezing Connecticut porch. Of 2 black trash bags. Of a deadbolt clicking into place behind her. Of a 16-year-old girl who had stood in stockinged feet on cold marble and had not yet known that the world contained a man like Frank Donovan, or a great-aunt like Eleanor, or a vault under a house on a bluff above the Hudson, or a father whose voice could still speak to her across 12 years of silence. She thought then of what her father had said to her once, sitting at the kitchen table in Greenwich, sliding tracing paper across a blueprint. Whitlock's read between the lines, savvy. He had not lived long enough to see her grow into the words. He had built her the door anyway. Savannah Whitlock looked out across the bluff toward the slow gray river that had been running south past this house for 100 years, before her name had been spoken in any room. She closed her hand around the 2 rings at her throat. Frank beside her on the bench exhaled a small ribbon of cigar smoke into the cold spring air. "Your father would be proud of you, kid." "I know," she said. It was the first time in 12 years that she had been able to say it. The sun came up over the eastern ridge. The light moved down the bluff. It reached the porch. Savannah Whitlock turned her face into it.